Thalassophobia is an intense phobia or fear of large bodies of water. And nothing epitomizes this more than if you imagine being in the middle of the ocean, far from land, and poking your head under the water with goggles on, and seeing the vast, empty expanse of dark water thousands of feet below you. You have no idea how deep it is or what lurks there, but you know that you're completely helpless to whatever it might be. So in today's video, we're going to go over 3 open water diving incidents. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Perfect depiction of thalassophobia is that iconic picture of a diver standing on the edge of an underwater cliff. Below him is the dark nothingness of the deep ocean. You have to figure that there are hundreds, if not thousands of these spots around the world where some geological feature has resulted in a cliff that extends so high from the ocean floor that it's literally not visible from above. Probably the most famous of these is the Great Blue Hole in Belize, because the dark, deep water in the sinkhole creates an incredible contrast with the light, shallow water of the surrounding area. A lesser-known example of these underwater drop-offs is actually off of the coast of Vancouver Island, which is simply known as the Wall. This drop-off is just a short boat ride from the city of Nanaimo and drops almost straight down to a depth of around 500 feet. In fact, it even states in the tour site that you want to be absolutely sure that you have control of your buoyancy before getting into the water. If you make a mistake, you will plummet 500 feet into the dark ocean. From the surface, it starts a bit more like a shallow shelf that isn't too steep, but as you descend deeper, it turns into an ominous drop-off into nothing. With that said, the wall is loaded with marine life, both on the wall and in the water. It's even known to have seals and sea lions curiously swim up to divers in the water, so despite how individuals with thalassophobia might feel about it, it is still a popular dive site. In October of 2013, 3 men planned to complete a technical dive of the wall to explore some of the deeper sections. Technical diving differs from recreational diving because it generally exceeds a certain depth and requires special training and equipment. And because of the depth, divers have to use a gas mixture different than regular air to ensure they don't suffer from something called nitrogen narcosis. This is usually a trimix of nitrogen, helium, and oxygen, which are mixed together in different ratios depending on the depth. This means that you need to ensure that you have the right mixture, otherwise you might pass out or suffer from several other ill effects. For their dive, they intended on getting to around 200 feet or 60 meters or so to check out the sea life. About 12 minutes into their dive, they were already down to this depth when suddenly one of the men lost consciousness and started an uncontrolled descent down the wall. His dive partner frantically swam after him and caught up to him at about 250 feet. He desperately tried to revive the man, but after being unable to, either due to shock or some other technical mistake, he made a rapid, uncontrolled ascent. This is another huge mistake, because when doing deep dives like this, you have to ascend slowly based on the time and depth of the dive. If this is done too rapidly, the dissolved gases in the blood don't emerge slowly and safely. They form bubbles inside of your tissue and vascular system. This can range from minor decompression sickness to the worst case scenario where these bubbles can completely block veins and arteries. This condition, known as arterial gas embolism, can lead to stroke and heart attack if these bubbles travel to the vessels in your heart and brain. So by the time the man surfaced from the water, he had gone into complete heart failure from the extensive gas embolism in his heart and brain. The third man surfaced a little while later without issue, but unfortunately, it was already too late. Authorities were notified and a search was launched for the final man who was still in the water. Eventually, he was found 2 days later and it was determined that he had lost consciousness due to oxygen toxicity and nitrogen narcosis. His body was recovered from the depth of 250 feet. A man named Tom and a woman named Eileen both attended the University of Louisiana in the late 1980s. Upon meeting one another, they almost immediately hit it off and would even go on to get married before finishing school. From then on, friends and family would say the pair were completely in love. Friends and family would also describe them as idealistic, and this idealism would cause them to eventually go on to join the Peace Corps. This organization is a group of volunteer individuals who travel to various impoverished countries and participate in humanitarian causes. Their 2-year tour took them to the islands of Fiji and Tuvalu in the South Pacific, and at the end of their tour, now 10 years into their marriage, they decided they would go and visit the Great Barrier Reef. Not only was it something they had always wanted to see, it was right near where they were stationed. In addition, when they first met, Eileen was already a passionate scuba diver and introduced Tom to the activity. From then on, both of them loved to go scuba diving together, and what better place to go scuba diving than the Great Barrier Reef? This massive reef is comprised of almost 3,000 individual sections and stretches for 2,300 kilometers off of the coast of Australia. Not only is it the largest reef on Earth, but it's also so large that it can be seen from outer space. It's actually the single largest structure made by a living organism. It's also home to an incredibly diverse ecosystem that thrives in the beautifully colorful structure. This makes it an incredible sight to behold and why it's so popular with scuba divers. There are very few other places that offer scuba diving quite like the Barrier Reef. So, in January of 1998, the couple arrived in Australia at Port Douglas to embark on their scuba diving adventure. They found an excursion that would take 26 passengers 40 kilometers off the Queensland coast to a section known as St. Crispin's Reef. This is one of the many subdivisions of the larger structure. Although it is a decent distance away from the shore, expeditions frequently take tourists to this area to experience the magnificent diving. When they arrived at the dive site, Tom and Eileen slipped into their scuba gear and hopped into the beautiful blue water of the Coral Sea. A little while later, all 26 passengers reboarded the boat, as was confirmed by a head count, and then the boat returned to Port Douglas. Except, when the crew was doing the head count, 2 passengers jumped into the water and then re-entered the boat. This threw off the count and meant that they were actually short 2 passengers. A little while after entering the water, Tom and Eileen resurfaced to the vast expanse of the ocean, with the boat nowhere in sight. They were even far enough from land that they couldn't see the shore, let alone swim to it if they knew its direction. This is when they would have come to the horrifying realization that they were stranded in the ocean. Another thing about this area off of the coast of Australia is that it's known for its massive 5-meter-long tiger sharks. All of the fish and other sea life are the perfect feeding ground for these large predators. Not to mention the fact that Tom and Eileen had no food or water and no way of contacting anyone for help. 2 days later, the captain of the expedition boat was cleaning out some of the leftover belongings and found 2 bags. In the bags were the wallets and passports of Tom and Eileen Lonergan. Upon finding these, he must have realized that they have gotten off the boat on land. They would have quickly returned to get these important items. So if they hadn't come to get them, they must have been left stranded in the ocean. He immediately contacted the police, and then a massive search was launched by the Australian Navy, including flyovers by planes and helicopters. Unfortunately, by the time the search was launched, it was too late, and Tom and Eileen were never seen again. 6 months later, a wetsuit washed up on the shore about 75 kilometers from Port Douglas. The wetsuit matched the same size wetsuit that Eileen would have worn, but initially investigators couldn't assume that it was hers. Unfortunately, a little while later, more equipment was found. It included 2 inflatable dive jackets with the couple's names written on them, Eileen's fins, and her compression tanks. They also recovered a diver's slate with a message on it. On it was the date and time they had been abandoned and a plea for help. Based on the findings, investigators felt that it was unlikely that a shark attack had occurred because there was no blood found anywhere on the wetsuit. And although the wetsuit was torn, the barnacle growth on it suggests that it had been submerged since the disappearance. During that time, it may have rubbed along the coral of the reef, which then tore the material. Following this revelation, the case became an internationally publicized event. The fact that it was 2 Americans who had gone missing in another country also added to the coverage. Initially, there was some speculation that the couple may have staged it, but this was quickly ruled out because neither of their bank accounts had been touched, and their life insurance policies remained intact. The company in charge of the expeditions would also be brought up in charges, and the ensuing legal battle would lead to even more controversy. The company's legal team even released segments of Tom and Eileen's diaries to the press that seemed to suggest that Tom had planned it in advance and Eileen worried for her safety. Friends and family of the couple dispute these claims and said that the passages were taken out of context. Only small segments were released to the press, whereas full context versions were available to law enforcement. Eventually, the captain of the expedition crew was found not guilty, but his company was charged with negligence and eventually went out of business as a result. So the leading theory is that the couple floated in the open ocean until they got very dehydrated. Severe enough dehydration is often accompanied by delirium, and so it's thought that the couple eventually removed their equipment in their delirious state. Without their highly buoyant wetsuits, it would be much more difficult to tread water, making it likely that they eventually drowned. This is supported by the fact that Eileen's wetsuit was found without her in it. It would have been very difficult for animals to have done this to her body otherwise. Following the event, much stricter regulations were put in place for all dive companies to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. In 1951, the super luxurious ocean liner Andrea Doria was launched from a shipyard in Genoa, Italy. This was the latest and greatest ocean liner at the time and was almost 700 feet long of pure luxury. It also happened to be the first ship of its kind to have 3 onboard swimming pools and held a total of 1,241 passengers along with 563 crew. But despite its newness and some of its luxury features, the Andrea Doria suffered from stability issues right from its maiden voyage. Although it featured a double hull and 11 watertight compartments, the ship was notoriously top-heavy. Anytime it was hit with anything significant from the side, it would list heavily. This was especially a problem when the fuel tanks were almost empty, which is obviously not a great feature in an environment where something might be battered by waves, like, for example, the ocean. So, on its literal first voyage, it was hit by a wave and listed 28 degrees to one side. This would set the tone for its entire short lifespan. Just 5 years later, in 1956, it was broadsided by another vessel known as the Stockholm, despite its state-of-the-art radar technology. Unfortunately, water in the supposedly watertight compartments could flow up and over in a great enough tilt, and so after being hit, the Andrea Doria listed to one side and would never right itself. Thankfully, unlike earlier vessels like the Titanic, it was well equipped with lifeboats and safety equipment. In addition, it took close to 11 hours to sink, allowing most of the passengers to escape unharmed. In total, 1,660 were saved of the 1,706 on board. Following their rescue, the Andrea Doria plummeted 160 feet to the ocean floor, where it now rests off the coast of Nantucket. Although this is out of range of recreational diving, the luxuriousness and uniqueness of the wreck made it a target for treasure divers. But as you might imagine, this is another activity that, much like the Andrea Doria itself, comes with several dangers. In fact, at least 22 people have lost their lives diving the wreckage since it first started getting explored. And it's only become more dangerous over time. By 2010, after having been submerged in the salt water for over 50 years, the wreckage had aged and deteriorated extensively. The salt water slowly ate away at the structure, causing the upper deck to slide into the seabed, and for the rest of it to fracture and collapse. This also means that the routes that had previously been dived have changed over the years, as others have become inaccessible. There's even a debris field that flows out of the openings of the ship as it makes an ominous metallic groaning and creaking. In addition to all of this, there are strong currents in the area that cause the heavy sediment to reduce visibility to zero and wrap errant fishing lines around the outside of the hull. But despite the hazards of the wreckage, it is still frequented by technical divers wanting to explore the unique piece of history. In 2015, the crew of a vessel known as the John Jack intended to make several dives of the wreckage. Two of the individuals that would be joining them were experienced divers Tom and Terry, who made the 6-hour trip from Pennsylvania to Rhode Island, where the John Jack was docked. After the long drive on that Monday night, Tom wasn't feeling all that great, and it was a tough dive, so he decided instead to help out with the equipment and join the next dive. The next day, after a good night of sleep, he felt much better and would join his friends Sean and Terry on a trip down to the Andrea Doria. The three friends slipped on their rebreathers and then started the long swim down. Their objective for that first dive was to secure one of the mooring lines holding the boat in place. Obviously, before they could explore, they had to ensure the wreckage was as safe as possible. In the Andrea Doria in particular, some of the individuals who have died over the years have gotten tangled in lines or nets, or just gotten lost in the wreckage in the low visibility. What's incredible is that most of these explorations are only around 15 minutes. Any longer, and there's an exponentially longer decompression time, so divers typically keep it short. Even just 15 minutes at that depth works out to an hour of decompression time. So, after the trio secured the mooring line for this trip, they would return for exploratory trips on subsequent dives. From the surface, they followed the 200-foot mooring line down to the seafloor and placed strobe lights along the way as markers. A little while later, Terry was on his way up and got visual confirmation from Tom, who was at the 20-foot decompression stop. It looked as though Tom signaled him to head up to the boat, but when Terry surfaced, Tom was nowhere to be found. He explained to the others what had happened, and they explained that Tom definitely hadn't surfaced. Upon hearing this, Terry frantically put his gear back on and jumped back into the water. But when he followed the mooring line back down, Tom was gone. The team on the surface radioed for help and threw garbage overboard to track the flow of the current, and then within 3 minutes, the Coast Guard was hovering above the John Jack. At the wreckage, Terry and Sean followed the mooring line and eventually found a third strobe light with Tom's initials on it, but there was still no sign of Tom. About an hour later, just the two of them emerged from the water once again. Weirdest of all was that of the three of them, Tom was known to be incredibly meticulous and safe. He was always super detail-oriented and double-checked all of his equipment on his 1,000 dives. Worse still was that because he was on a rebreather, he could still be alive with spare gas under the surface but caught in the wreckage or the net or one of the lines. Unfortunately, when the weather worsened on the surface, the boat's captains refused to allow anyone else in the water. The current was bad enough that it even broke off one of the ship's ladders as it patrolled the dive site. About 40 hours and 350 square nautical miles later, the search was officially called off. It's thought that on his way up, Terry may have mistaken Sean for Tom, and Tom never actually surfaced. It could have been equipment failure or medical emergency or some other accident related to the wreckage, but unfortunately, Tom's body was never recovered. At least one other individual has died in the years since, and the Andrea Doria remains a popular diving spot to this day.